In 1814, a baby girl was born in a tiny Scottish village. She was named Margaret after her mother. Her father worked long, hard days cutting trees in the forests of Aberdeenshire. When she grew up, she married her sweetheart in a dress that, despite her tall figure, failed to obscure 8 months of pregnancy. Over the next 18 years, Margaret gave birth to 7 children. And when her youngest, James, was 2, she was admitted to the Aberdeen Lunatic Asylum. When James was 9, his dear sister Jane set off in a sailing ship to a place they called New Zealand. She said it was on the other side of the world. As soon as James came of age, he followed his big sister to that faraway place. Was he running away from the spectre of his mother's madness? We'll never know, but he took with him an inheritance deep within the fibre of his being. James passed the inheritance to his son William, who passed it on to Mavis, my grandmother. My name is Bridget. For generations, Huntington's disease has decimated my family.
Huntington disease has been described as the worst disease known to man. Huntington robs you of who you are.
Involuntary movement, which is called chorea. It's actually a word that comes from the Greek word meaning a dance, and we get the modern word choreography from it.
The worst thing is watching somebody's personality melt away.
Huntington patients are really trapped within their own bodies.
There's also an increased incidence of suicide.
It is a slowly progressive disease that plays out over a couple of decades.
We don't have many treatments for Huntington's disease, and there's no cure for Huntington's disease at the present time.
But even worse than that is that at the time that you might be dying of your illness is the recognition that your children might also follow the same course.
Will my generation witness the yielding of this affliction, or will it continue unabated? This is the story of me and my family facing up to an invisible enemy that threatens everything we love. I was too young to know my grandmother Mavis very well, but my mum would tell me about her.
She would take herself to town and go in by bus, and she would fall over in the street, and people thought she was an alcoholic. There was a chemist shop there that she went to a lot, and he was very good. He would take her in if she got in strife and look after her and put her in a taxi and get her home. So she ended up in hospital, and I'll never, ever forget going in and finding her in this ward, and here she was. She must have been on Valium, and she was just, all the traces of the personality had gone, and she was just doped up to the eyeballs, just sitting there. Sort of in retrospect, we should have done more for her. Didn't really realise at that stage what it was. I thought she may have had Parkinson's and a nervous breakdown. And it wasn't until you were born that we found out it was Huntington's.
Mum was shocked. She was told that it was hereditary. The odds were 50-50 that she had inherited it, and if she had, she may have already passed it on to any number of her 3 children. Mavis died after 15 years of mental and physical deterioration at the age of 62. Mum told me how much it meant to have the chance to say goodbye.
I was at Massey at a seminar. Dad had been able to get a message to me that Mum was not expected to last the evening. So I drove from Palmerston North to Wanganui. And she waited for me. It breaks my heart to think what we didn't do for her, that I didn't stop and listen and talk to her and ask her things, and just talked too much and didn't think. It's just that she missed out and us finding out what it was and then being able to help her.
I always knew about the risk of Huntington's disease because of my parents' attitude that they shouldn't hide anything from their 3 children. and we grew up in a frenzy of adventure with a family motto of trying to fit in as much as we could to every day. Meanwhile, scientists had been hard at work, and in 1993, the gene for Huntington's disease was found after 10 years of searching, near the top of chromosome 4. The following year, Mum took advantage of the newly developed predictive test, which could tell her if she had inherited the HD gene. It doesn't skip a generation, so if she didn't have it, then me and my brothers couldn't have it.
When Jude was tested positive for the disease, I was just crying my eyes out. It was a tragedy to know that this disease could be possibly passed on to you children.
Genes are made up of 4 chemicals that are represented by the letters A, C, G, and T. What the scientists had found was remarkably simple. On the top of chromosome 4, the parts are spelled C-A-G. Everyone has this gene, but people who have Huntington's disease have too many repeats of CAG in theirs. That's what the genetic test tells you, how many CAG repeats you have. Mum has 43.
Particularly over 39, people would tend to develop Huntington's disease.
Anyone who has an expanded gene has a 50% chance of passing on that gene anytime they have a kid. So it's exactly like tossing a coin.
If you could actually get that surgically implanted in your head, then you wouldn't actually need to carry it around and free up your arms.
After some years of living in the UK, where my brothers Nick and Warwick were also living, I settled in Sydney. And by 2003, I found myself in love and unexpectedly pregnant. I'd been so sure I would find out my gene status before bringing children into the world. But Jeff and I found termination wasn't an option. After our beautiful boy was born, I quickly had the test. I was thinking I'd be let off the hook, that they would say, "You don't have Huntington's," and I'd go around cheering and everything would be lovely. But it wasn't. I too would dance the wretched dance.
And we all fall down. And we broke our crown.
What? Normally?
Tragically, around 10% of people with Huntington's are children. But the average age for adult onset is between 35 and 45. And generally, the earlier you get it, the faster it progresses. Luckily, Mum didn't start developing symptoms until her mid-50s. She'd always been a great talker, and words started to fail her.
These little plants I'm trying to grow in my own garden because they are local wild plants.
As Mum's symptoms crept up on her, I found my test results had left me feeling guilty for my child's future. I thought if I came to understand the disease more, I could show him I wasn't afraid of it. As an HD family, we had been inextricably linked to scientists studying the disease. My mum had been friends with the visionary neuroscientist, Professor Fall, for many years. He's the director of the Centre for Brain Research in Auckland, where they study Huntington's brains.
She had no symptoms when I first met her. She was always the person who I felt better for having met. So what is really interesting about Huntington's disease is that it causes cells to die in their millions in the area called the basal ganglia. It sits right in the centre of the brain. In the normal brain, you can see the basal ganglia there, this is the normal brain. Whereas in the Huntington's brain, they are shrunken down. As a result, the ventricle becomes massive.
Along with Professor Fall, scientists all around the world had been working passionately on understanding Huntington's for decades. Their progress was gathering momentum.
The cerebral cortex, that enormous sheet of tissue around the surface of the brain, which actually separates humans from other primates. This is one of the most evolved parts of the human brain, also becomes dysfunctional. But the more we look, the more we find.
To understand what they had discovered, we have to go deep down into the fibre of our beings, to see our bodies 1,000,000 times magnified when molecular machines replicate the mutant Huntington's DNA, unaware of the mistake in the recipe.
It's a bad gene, which makes a bad protein, and it does a lot of bad things, and that's a scary thing. You know, in some diseases you're lucky, and it might be, you know, one bad protein maybe like kills a blood cell. The really difficult thing with Huntington's disease and the Huntington protein, it does a lot of bad things.
Proteins cluster together, so they become kind of sticky, like glue, so they form these very small balls inside the nerve cells inside the brain.
It's a bit like pouring cement inside a brain cell, which causes the brain cells to die.
This gene is expressed everywhere in all the cells in the body, and we might get effects in all the cells in the body. So it's more than a disease of the brain, I would say.
It's estimated around 600,000 people worldwide have Huntington's disease. Symptoms are varied in their severity and onset for each person. It helps to break it down into 4 stages. What are you doing, Mum?
I'm making my soy porridge. I have to concentrate. Half a cup goes on there. That's because I don't want to lose any weight.
The initial symptoms are quite subtle. Mum started getting the movements late at night, and she'd sit there with her leg or her arm jerking around, but she'd always hold them down.
That person may become over familiar with strangers. They may lose the ability to understand other people's emotions.
I have to get back so that I'm happy and positive, and the idea, the steps, so that I know what to do, what to acknowledge, and in order to go forward.
The hardest part probably is the irrationality of it.
People might do bizarre stuff, like start buying things that they would have never spent money on before, and go through a lot of money, and also being unable to work. So families end up often in a very poor financial situation.
There should never be nothing you can do for someone with Huntington's disease. It bothers me that I think around the world, patients and families are still left with that impression. They go to the doctor's office and they're told, well, that's a fatal disease. There's nothing I can really do for you.
I was always told as a medical student, we don't make new brain cells. Well, in the Huntington's brain, you see, we found that this layer of stem cells was in fact not only there, but we saw it multiplying. And the more advanced the disease, the more new brain cells the brain was trying to make from these stem cells. In other words, it was trying to repair itself. By studies that we then did on the normal brain, we found that every person can make new brain cells. That was revolutionary.
We made this discovery that if we took the mice and increased their levels of mental and physical activity, we found that led to a dramatic delay in onset of these symptoms of Huntington's disease in the mice. The idea that you can stay more mentally and physically active and build in a brain reserve, but together with a good diet and other things that are healthy for the body and therefore healthy for the brain.
Mum exercised, took supplements, used brain training and alternative therapies.
She'd read and know everything that was going on about the disease. She would see all the challenges and the ways you could overcome the disease.
We're taking a different attitude to it, and that we're trying all sorts of things. If there's a possibility that this will work, we'll give it a go. We believe that cumulatively they've been able to slow down the progression of the disease.
She really led the way with finding ways to beat Huntington's.
The one thing that every HD person will say is that they are convinced, without question, that exercise is helpful. Aerobic daily
Great. Couldn't it have been that lying around like a slob was the thing they found helped? Did it have to be exercise? I'd avoided it reasonably well for 20 years, and now it was my lifeline. The problem is you have to get going quite fast to get brain regeneration, and I wasn't going that fast. Charles Sabine, a former TV journalist, is now a spokesperson for people with Huntington's disease. He's got the gene too. As I talked to him, I sensed that he lived with the same knowing that I did, the same background hum of dread.
The important point is environmental enrichment. What you don't want to do is sit in a room so as not to have any stress. But the one good thing is about the frickin' disease is that grass is good for you. It's dope.
Really?
Cannabis,
Really?
cannabinoid receptors, good for you. Sex is probably good.
Yeah.
I mean, I just say that as logically as because it's environmental enrichment and it's exercise that's getting your heart rate up, depending on who's on top, I suppose.
Speaking of which, Jeff and I wanted to have another child. Lucky for us, those hard-working scientists had come up with a way to have children free of the disease. In early 2006, we booked in for IVF. Our chance of success was around 35%. In addition to normal IVF, we had to go through a process called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. We had 22 eggs collected. 5 days later, only 4 had grown to the size they needed to be for testing. It turned out that 3 of the 4 had the Huntington's gene. So we had 1 embryo without HD, 1 chance. We were extremely lucky, and the embryo resulted in a pregnancy. And a gorgeous baby boy was born, who has 0% chance of having Huntington's disease.
So if you don't have the gene, then you can't pass it on.
That's right. And that's why with our second son, he won't develop Huntington's and he won't pass it on.
It's floating. It's floating.
And your first son, you don't know. Have you discussed with your partner about when he should know?
The genetic counsellors strongly advise that children aren't tested for Huntington's, and so it's after he's 18 he can decide for himself whether or not he wants to be tested. So I don't think it's something that he needs to know before he's an adult.
The technology that Bridget and Jeff have used to conceive young James. If PGD had been available, and had we known at the time we were conceiving our children, would we have done that? Absolutely. Boots and all.
So now we can control even this wonderful birth of James. So much is good. You know, compared to what did happen when we started out, which was really just despair and horror. So we've come a long way.
Once Mum's brain deteriorated further, she would visit us and do crazy things like wander around naked, seeing things that weren't there. And I would watch her horrified, walking about like a living nightmare. I would imagine myself that way in my future. Then I would imagine my son with it, then go back to being horrified for her. If my son does have the gene, I worry that I won't be there to look after him. A friend of my mum has been looking after her son for the last 19 years.
You remember Judy, don't you? Yeah? Used to come and have a cup of tea at our place, didn't she? She was always so good because she, you know, Darren, he's been on a thickened diet for 6 years now on the pureed food. So he sort of had his first symptoms at 27. They've got him on the medication for hallucinating. You don't know what he's thinking. Sometimes he looks absolutely terrified.
So how have you managed, without your heart breaking, or has it broken?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's what it is. It just definitely cracks. You can only do so much to help. You know, you're kind of powerless, really. As a mother, you think, oh, I can always look after my child and protect them, but you can't. But you just can't give in, and you've got to keep on doing what you can do.
I am inspired by her, by the way she's fought to try to keep the symptoms at bay. I was probably more inspired a few years ago, and just lately she's been deteriorating quite a lot. One of the symptoms of Huntington's is losing social inhibition. We went to a cafe once and she got too hot, so she took both her tops off and she was sitting there in a bra.
People with Huntington's disease can develop psychiatric problems. The most common is depression. The other area would be psychosis, believing in things that are not true, and also hallucinations, that's seeing or hearing things that are not perceivable by other people.
She was starting to think that Dad was really out to get her, and then after a while, after she'd been there, she started to think that you were out to get her, and then finally she started to worry about me being out to get her.
She thought that I was trying to kill her.
And it wasn't until we got to a drug called Seroquel that we got onto a drug which she could live on.
As soon as she took those pills, within 24 hours, she was
back to normal.
Back to normal.
Just about everybody who meets her and comments to me says, look, she's trying, she's doing so well, but she does look like she's drunk.
One thing they say about the chorea, you know, the movement disorder, is that it actually bothers other people much more than it does the person with the... Because it's horrible to see. It's very scary. My brother's got really bad chorea now.
Oh, she can't keep her legs still. It's like trying to stop a train.
Some days, to me, I don't move. Do you see me moving? Bridget, do you see me moving?
Yeah.
A little bit, a lot.
The connections between the deep movement centres and the frontal lobe, the big bit at the front of the brain that's unique to humans and gives us our personality, but also our sense of self. And so the connections between those two areas are affected early in Huntington's, which is probably why we get this combination of involuntary movements, but also loss of insight, and particularly loss of insight into those movements.
I can't really have a conversation with Mum. The responses are, you know, they are quite simple, but sometimes she can be so lucid, so, you know, all of a sudden you can have a conversation about something. You live for those moments.
What do you say to people when you meet them and you want them to know?
No, I just say I have Huntington's disease, and it affects my brain.
She's still going for her walks as best she can. She's still going to the gym. We're looking at a trial on a drug called Dimibond. It's the big hope we have.
He has to tell her to do everything, you know, to get dressed, which clothes to wear. And she follows him about, and yet still, he just loves her, and he'll do anything for her.
Some families wouldn't be able to cope with it, but quite a lot of divorces and that sort of thing through it.
She thinks she's beating it, and it's the drugs, but, you know, in her mind, she's getting better. I don't have the heart to tell her otherwise.
I'm speaking it. I'm speaking it. And making the most of it, so.
It continues to amaze me how courageous and resilient families are with Huntington's disease.
For some people, this will bring out the best in the family. In other families, the gene tears families apart.
You cannot go through the course of Huntington's disease alone. And in fact, I don't think that a couple can really go through the course of Huntington's disease alone, just the two of them. In fact, I feel as a physician, I can't really care for a patient or a couple with Huntington's disease by myself. I think it is done best by a team, by a community, by a family.
People's relationships change from being husband and wife. It's very different to being carer and patient. It's a totally different relationship.
The thing that motivates me is going back and looking at photos of her, particularly when we were courting and when we were engaged and when we were married.
He's so proud of how gorgeous she is. He was so proud he got her.
Who would ever deny she isn't worth looking after for the rest of her life? Such a stunning person. It's easy knowing the times we had then to say, well, okay, it's my turn. my turn to look after her.
Her brain just doesn't compute those instructions.
And I think she's aware of it because
Yeah.
she says to me things like, my brain won't work.
Yeah. You're lucky, you're from a strong family. Some people have got nobody else, and if I don't help them, there is nobody. Either their families are dead, or they've disowned them because they've created mayhem, or they've got no money, or they've drunk themselves into oblivion. I had a client who was very, very unwell, and he had a phone bill and he couldn't pay it. And he was living in a house and it had this huge lemon tree out the back. And a friend said, I've got this great recipe for a lemon cordial that was my grandmother's. So I started making it and I sell it so that I can pay the bills for people, buy them things that they need.
Jeanette also takes people to the hydrotherapy pool.
Rise up on your toes, look over the sides, the other way round. And back, and up, and down. 4. And you walk at the same time.
I'm gonna get drunk in that water.
Bev has falls, she chokes sometimes, she sees a psychologist, and she's on medication.
I have 6 boys, and I'm sure 5 haven't got it.
How many brothers and sisters do you have, and how many of them have Huntington's?
We only have Jude's got it, Charlie's got it, I've got it, Sue's got it, Eric's got it, Don's got it. Penny's it in. I think there's about 2 that don't, might be 10 do.
Karen was only diagnosed last year, and she does have quite a few falls.
Because I never knew what it was, never heard of it, really. It must be on my father's side, but it's never been in the picture. I've had a couple of quarters like that.
And people haven't helped her out?
Oh, no. I live in Nana, don't move to Nana.
But we've certainly had people that taxi drivers have thought were drunk and weren't keen to pick up.
When I was a child, my mother became a founding member of the local Huntington's Disease Association and did her part to raise awareness of the disease. In the 80s, she got a book about living with Huntington's disease from Dr. Edmund Chu. For me, it was the first time I'd seen the words Huntington's disease associated with the word living, rather than the word death. This man, Dr. Chu, became a point of light in my teenage brain. Advocacy in Huntington's disease has mostly been family-led. When the singer Woody Guthrie died of it in 1967, his wife Marjorie campaigned to raise awareness of it. A year later, Milton Wexler set up the Hereditary Disease Foundation after his wife was diagnosed with the disease. They had 2 children. Nancy went on to be instrumental in the discovery of the gene, and Alice became a historian. I'd always wanted to know more about where the name Huntington had come from. Alice told me about the town of East Hampton in the US, where in the 19th century there were many families with the disease.
In 1806, there was in the newspaper a little article about a woman who had disappeared one morning. Her husband had come home, she was working at home, she was ironing clothes, and her husband had gone to bed, leaving her there, working late at night. But when he got up in the morning, she wasn't there.
It has been duty to publish the following melancholy circumstance which took place at East Hampton a few weeks since. Captain David Hedges returned to his home in the evening and found Mrs. Hedges ironing clothes and apparently in good health.
In the doctor's journals, it had this woman whose name was Phoebe Hedges had called for the doctor to come and see her. She had been prescribed various calming medications.
After considerable search and inquiry, her footsteps were traced from the house through fields of grain to the shore. and there is every reason to believe she has precipitated herself into the surf which washes the South Shore. Mrs. Hedges was about 40 years of age and was much esteemed by her neighbors. This extraordinary step is attributed to her extreme dread of the disorder called St. Vitus dance, with which she began to be affected and which her mother now has to a great degree. From some arrangements of her clothing, it appears she had for some time contemplated her melancholy end.
Years later in the same town, a doctor, the son of the doctor who had treated Phoebe Hedges, was visiting patients with his 12-year-old son.
We suddenly came upon two women, mother and daughter, both bowing, twisting, grimacing. What could it mean?
The young boy's name was George Huntington.
He's an interesting guy because, for one thing, he was only 21, I think, when he wrote his famous paper describing the hereditary pattern. Other people had written about it. They knew it was hereditary, but not the specific way that it was inherited. His father and his grandfather were all physicians in East Hampton, so they had been there for almost 75 years, and they had, as their neighbors, families with this disease, so they had seen the different generations. And George Huntington always said, without his father and his grandfather, he could never have written the paper that he wrote.
Subsequently, of course, the disease was named after him. Around the same time, over the other side of the Atlantic in Scotland, my great-great-great-grandmother was decaying in the Aberdeen Lunatic Asylum.
29th of April, 1856. Name, Margaret Purray, 42 years. Those at present marking the disorder are unnatural elevation of spirits, violent temper, and a disposition much the reverse of that natural to her. She has been violent towards her husband at times. She has also several delusions of witchcraft and others, such as that people are doing her harm, casting ill upon her, but latterly her talk has been mostly about money-making.
On the 12th of February 1857, the doctor noted, "This case has remained stationary since admission. She is noisy, excited, and incoherent when addressed." 5 months later, increasing emaciation and debility of body have become associated with an acute attack of bronchitis, which has confined her to her bed for about a fortnight and which seems to be threatening a fatal termination. 9 days later, she was dead. Her son James would have been just 3 at her funeral. He would have had no memory of her when, as an adult, he emigrated to New Zealand.
Well, my face is wet today, not tears but ocean spray. I am bringing you a gift from the heart.
He married another immigrant when he was 33, an English girl called Mary, and had 4 children. He was 46 when he accidentally drowned, crossing the Manawatu River. His son William lived long enough to develop the disease, however, and in fact be diagnosed by a doctor out from Scotland around 1950 who recognised Huntington's disease. But for some reason, the rest of the family was never told. I can't imagine what it would have been like to bear such a burden alone.
I am bringing you a gift from the heart.
Skiing had always been the way our family came back together, even when we lived far apart. But this time, in 2009, our family was struggling with the fallout from predictive testing. 4 years earlier, my eldest brother Nick had taken the test, but chose to keep his positive result very private, just to close friends and family. Meanwhile, my other brother Warwick prepared to take his predictive test. This strong family was creaking at its foundations.
It's a hell of a legacy to leave your kids to have to deal with it. They've all done remarkably well.
The odds are still 50-50, although it's tempting, isn't it, to think that it's going to fall the right way this time.
While in our family, we'd all wanted to be tested. It wasn't something everyone at risk of Huntington's wanted to do.
By far, the majority of people are not having predictive testing, but those who want the predictive gene test really want it.
When I was working for NBC in the last days of the war in Bosnia, I was taken captive by some Mujahideen guerrillas who had executed some people the day before. So we were by the wall where they'd executed these people, and one of them held a grenade to my head at one point, which is about as scary a moment as you can imagine, but that was not as scary as taking that test for HD. For someone who already knows about what Huntington's disease is, to go through that test, which is going to be so completely and utterly determining.
So this is Mapping Fate, a book written by Alice Wexler about her family. There's something at the front of it. Everyone, real or imagined, deserves the open destiny of life. The open destiny of life, that's what got me. And that's what I feel like it's been taken away because I did the predictive test.
Did you think, there's absolutely no way I'm going to have that disease?
When I was a kid, my mum didn't know what she was.
So it needed both of you to...
Yeah, and that would be really unlucky, right?
Yeah. Well, the luck thing, you always start thinking about luck, don't you? Do you find you start thinking about casinos and like red and black, flipping coins and stuff? Because I thought my father had it, my brother had it, someone's got to not have it.
That's what I'm thinking,
law, you know, like, surely.
That's right, because I was the first one to be tested, so I thought... I realised when my brother got tested and he also had it, I was pissed off. I thought, I'm supposed to be the fall guy. And so my second brother, the third of us siblings, is going to have his test soon, and we're all just going...
Oh, God.
Warwick took the test, and he too tested positive. 3 out of 3. Bad luck.
It's devastating to know that we've passed on this Huntington's gene.
My heart cracks. There'll be no one from our generation left functioning. My partner Jeff will be the only person left standing. Warwick and I talked about other things, about everything else but Huntington's. A few days later, I called my other brother Nick in the UK.
It surprised me a bit. And, I never ever paused to think about, have I been hard done by, because there just simply isn't any point. It was cast in stone 40 years ago. We need to plan to be about to support one another. And we've got to make sure that the boys are taken care of. We've got to think about what we want to put ourselves and those that will be caring for us through. So there's the big question about how much of the HD experience you want to have too. I mean, I'm not interested in these middle or late stages. I've got no plans to go there. It sounds macabre, doesn't it? But I mean, it's probably I like to call it the Swiss appointment. Plus, I've also had the most astonishing time.
It's hard. I'm a bit attached to life, to be honest. I'm really attached to it. So attached to it.
Yeah, but you have to give it up at some point, right?
I hear about someone who might be able to help me, a real expert on living with this disease.
They think for me is the fact that I'm the youngest of 5.
How many of you have Huntington's out of the 5?
All of us. because most of us passed away between 40 and 48. What am I'm saying my sister passed away and did the suicide in the car with the vacuum cleaner pipe. I was thinking about doing what my sister did because I thought at least then my son wouldn't have to watch me disintegrate day by day. I thought the fact I had my son, I thought maybe not, because I felt it would be selfish to do that.
I've got two brothers, and we all have had the genetic test, and we're all going to get Huntington's.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd like some advice on how you manage that.
Good luck. No, it's a bit of I try and cope with a bit of humour. I suppose I've maybe facially, I think in my face it might show just a wee bit, and I find facially, and I feel occasionally that my movements aren't as quick, but that could be the fact I'm getting older. Okay, could be something to do with the fact I'm a bit older now. And it happens so quick. I told them, I've always said I wanted a young and good looking. Do you want a hug? Sorry, I know it's difficult.
Happy birthday to you. Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Now where's Jamesy to help blow out the candle? There he is. Okay, all together. 1, 2, 3, blow!
The idea of imagining your future with Huntington's is that you think, oh no, I'm going to be an idiot. I'm going to lose everything that I've worked so hard to be, you know. As you're losing all those things that are important to you, you're conscious of it. I don't know how you deal with that.
Aiming to beat it is the healthiest way to deal with it.
The problem right now is that whenever I do anything silly, I think that it's Huntington's coming on. I'm really almost smack bang in the middle of the time when you're supposed to get it. He can tell me that maybe I don't have any symptoms, but I'm still stuck with the fact that I'm going to get it sometime. I should be exercising a lot more, but I've really turned a corner with it, you know. And now I'm running and swimming and doing yoga. Nick, my older brother, makes it sound so intense, and he's so intense about it. He does this whole thing where he says, this is a discipline for the rest of our lives if we want to keep ourselves off the feeding tube. He's deeply dramatic, and it also deeply freaks me out.
Bridget, I'm going to give you a letter of the alphabet, and I would like you to generate as many words as you can.
Potato, pear,
Animals.
lion, tiger, hamster.
Name these pictures for me.
Kangaroo, penguin, anchor, rhinoceros. October, September.
We now realise that people could develop thinking difficulties up to 15 years before they develop movement problems. So we've tested your thinking ability and your movement today, and both of them are clear, so that's good news. There are many circumstances where different family members in the same family have the same CAG repeat count, but they still have different ages of onset.
That was it then. I'd watch for early symptoms. At least I wouldn't be like my great-grandfather William and grandmother Mavis. As their symptoms came on, they would have had no idea what they were. When great-grandfather William was finally diagnosed, he would have found himself living in a society inhospitable to hereditary disease.
In the late part of the 19th century, early 20th century, this movement called eugenics became very popular to bring about, quote unquote, better breeding, to improve the human race. There were many advocates of compulsory sterilization, particularly in mental institutions. There was a biologist named Charles Davenport who was the leading eugenics scientist in the United States, and the conclusion that he drew was people with Huntington should not have children. Other people advocated that people at risk for Huntington's ought to get sterilized. One of the main ways that eugenics has influenced Huntington's families by creating the idea that, of course, you shouldn't have children.
For generations upon generations, the disease has been associated with evil, bad families, witchcraft. So inevitably, there's been a shame and a stigma about the disease, which has profoundly affected the status of the people who have it.
For me personally, when I started to learn about this history, I got much more understanding of my mother. I had been very angry at her. Why didn't you tell us this? This is really important for Nancy and me to know about. She had grown up during that era of eugenics in the 1930s and in fact had studied biology. So I thought she had good reasons for keeping it a secret.
The misdiagnosis tended to happen because people, general practitioners and doctors didn't see the disease because it was hidden, so they didn't recognize it. So people who did have it were just diagnosed as being lunatics and just stuck in an asylum, or even more recently, diagnosed as having schizophrenia.
When I tried to learn about Huntington disease in South Africa or Africa in the late 70s, there was almost nothing written. In fact, most of my mentors told me it didn't exist. We then went on to visit every single mental hospital in the country and identified hundreds of patients with Huntington disease.
It has been massively, hugely underestimated in its prevalence because of all of this.
In some parts of the world, even today, just as there's discrimination with people with mental illness, Huntington disease is hidden.
Up until this point, people have been ashamed about having this disease.
Many families still don't talk about it, and if they do talk about it, it doesn't go well.
They might have said that their grandfather had Parkinson's, or somebody committed suicide, and then they just said they had some psychiatric illness.
My family, including my mother or my brother and his family, do not say the H word.
I remember Jude was very open. When she tested positive, she put a notice on the staff notice board telling everybody she tested positive for Huntington's disease. Brilliant.
These diseases are just like diabetes and cancer. These are unfortunate, but they don't carry any other value judgment. They don't say who you are as a person. They say you're just unfortunate.
Communication brings awareness, and that process dissolves fear.
The patients, the families who are open about it, who engage themselves in the larger community, who do not marginalize the person who's suffering with the disease, amazing, beautiful, wonderful things happen.
In June of 2011, Judy was diagnosed with rectal cancer as well.
Because it's in her bowel, it also means that she is incontinent of feces. Because she doesn't understand necessarily what's going on, she might take everything off and just go to the toilet wherever, because she's not conscious of doing that.
She's probably just going to die of cancer.
I mean, you know what,
it's
that's
probably a good
good.
thing, I know. Except that it's really tricky because Dad's trying to deal with her.
Of course. I mean, and I don't mean to sound glib about that at all.
No,
I mean, I know, you can sound
I know.
But I wish that my father, that there could have been something that could have taken him before the last year.
The cancer grew and blocked Mum's bowel, so if she didn't have a colostomy operation, she would die. As a family, we'd previously discussed that we would let the cancer take her. But when it came to the moment of truth, we couldn't let her go.
She's so loving, aren't you? And from now on, you're going to do everything that David said? Did you say yes? Yes. Oh, that's it.
For your father, the hardest thing is that he really thought they had slowed your mum's deterioration and they'd done everything that they could. And I think that's really difficult for him to now see that things haven't been stopped.
You're having a bit of trouble with the carers. How's that been more recently?
It's got me.
And when did you last see your grandchildren? What are their names, the ones you saw most recently?
Finn and James.
Hello. Just come and see how you're getting on.
And that's like I enjoy that too.
Oh, that's a nice thing to say, George. That's a really nice thing to say. It used to be lovely when we went out for cups of coffee and to the pool and things, doesn't it?
It's good. I actually enjoy that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was great. What are you watching on TV?
Me.
What's this program about?
Me.
You? Really? Is it a music program?
Me.
Jeff and I and the boys had moved to Wellington from Sydney to be closer to family.
Why are you out of bed?
Because I think basically I really should be with another group of people. And at this stage it should be. According to everyone else that got here, I should be doing something else, you know. Yeah, I like being out here.
You like being out here?
Morning. Morning, Judith.
It's the most beautiful day I think I've ever seen out there. We've got to make ourselves decent, don't we? One night I was saying goodnight to Mum. I stared in her eyes and she stared back at me with eyes filled with love. I soaked it up. We'd connected. She blinked and told me she hated me.
I guess it is sad for us, for our relationship in a way, because there's very little to it, because she can't react emotionally to me like she used to, physically like she used to.
Symptomatically, from the cancer point of view, I don't think there's been much of a change, but certainly from Huntington's, she has deteriorated.
But you realise the horrible people I have to look after.
Do you? That's a big job, isn't it? To look after all those people?
All horrible ones. Yeah. Well, are they nice or are they horrible?
They're nice, so don't worry. Don't worry. No, don't worry.
I hate people.
I know.
I hate people.
I know, but
hate people.
Let's just worry about having breakfast. All right?
Hate you.
I know. Here we go. There we go. How's that? Isn't that nice?
Actually, you know how much I hate people.
I know.
I hate you. I hate people and I should like them. Thank you.
Okay.
How are you doing today?
Really awful.
And why do you feel awful?
Because I'm awful.
Why are you awful?
I don't know.
Hmm?
I like being awful.
You like being awful.
Into the shower.
Do you like the carers giving you a shower? Does that feel nice?
I like it.
Have you hit? Don't worry. No, don't worry.
I hate people.
Shall I go and get your porridge?
I do.
Okay. I got more.
What? Do you have you? Why? Ew.
Can you tell me what you think Mum is thinking?
You mean, can I look at her and tell what she's thinking? There's a pretty big vacuum there.
I don't ticklish on the feet.
And how old are you?
20.
And are you married?
Yes.
Who are you married to?
David.
You constantly do what you can to keep her in the best of health, to keep her from pain. I don't know where it goes from here. See, there's things like eating.
1, 2, 3.
She's still eating.
1, 2, 3. Down you go. That's it. Here we
Nice.
go.
Very nice. You in pain? Where does it hurt?
Further down the track. It depends. I mean, you might find that the cancer leaves it behind. Don't have to worry about that sort of thing. But she is at times in a lot of pain, and I can only assume that's from the cancer.
I love you. I love you, Grandma.
Since coming to live in New Zealand, I felt a bit confronted by Mum's situation and really honestly been thinking she'd be better off not living, really. And I just kept anticipating that she'd be kind of dying at some point from the cancer or from the Huntington's. But having spoken to Jeanette, it seems that people can go on for years and years in the state that Mum's in. Maybe Mum being able to see her grandchildren play on the lawn is the equivalent of doing something incredibly marvelous. In a way, what she's doing is kind of what Buddhist monks achieve. Thoughtlessness. I think they call it mindfulness though, don't they? It's a bit different.
As a youngster, I always believed that a cure would come along for Mum. I guess then I was hopeful that a cure would come along that would fix me.
The gene's been around 20 years, and initially people thought there was going to be a cure the next year or the year after.
I think it's been a long time waiting.
I didn't know what to believe about the likelihood of a cure. The Dimibond trials had been inconclusive. I went to find out for myself. I got to meet a hero of mine, the scientific legend, Michael Hayden.
Okay, so thank you for doing all this. You know, this is a big contribution for the whole community.
It's because I've only got a certain number of years where I'm compos mentis, so after a while it won't matter anymore.
Well, I've got good news or bad news for you. You might have more time than you expect.
That would be very good.
So, you know, you might have more time of compos mentis. I suspect we're going to find ways to modify that reality in one form or another. Who knows what form it's going to take. And the key thing now is to recognize that and have that hope. I think there's a light at the end of this tunnel. Was this your mum or dad?
Mum.
Mum. So your disease is going to be different to mum. There was a time that polio was a fatal illness, or the AIDS, and all these diseases have been overcome. Huntington's is different, but we're making massive inroads, and the communities come together in ways that are incredible. So I'm quite hopeful. I'm hopeful not that we'll cure this disease, but that we'll have a way to change the course of this illness in your lifetime. Scientists around the world have now come together in a community that's really profound, sharing, cooperating, collaborating in ways unprecedented.
Amongst scientists, I think that Huntington's disease is sometimes regarded as kind of a model disease for perhaps both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
The level of cells, there's a lot of commonalities between what's going wrong in a Huntington's brain and what might be going wrong in an Alzheimer's or a Parkinson's brain.
Huntington's is uniquely special because of the fact that you can genetically predict it before people have the disease. So Huntington's is uniquely positioned to offer the testing ground for therapies that could have influence for all sorts of diseases.
My brother Nick has had his brain scanned 2 or 3 times a year for the past 5 years as part of the effort to track disease progression.
I just get the email, Nick, will you come and I'm doing it. You just see the words HD, scan, research. I don't even read them now, just reply, yes, what dates? Today was an MRI for 90 minutes and then a PET scan as well in the afternoon. And then they wanted to do more tests. So we did more cognition tests. The Track HD scans and researches and researching and checkups is all about trying to see changes in the brain that they think are happening 10 or 15 years before you become outwardly symptomatic.
There's been profound progress in terms of understanding mechanisms. We understand what are some of the causes of the neuronal loss, the neuronal injury that occurs in Huntington disease.
We use a fruit fly model. We can insert the human gene into the fruit fly, and this allows us to look at genetic modifiers so we can understand how these genes might be normally trying to protect the cells from death. And then hopefully if we can find these genes that are helpful, we might be able to boost them, for example.
This is a concept that I call environmemetics. These would be drugs which mimic or enhance the beneficial effects of this environmental stimulation.
We have generated a transgenic sheep model of Huntington's disease. We're now looking to see if we can inject into the brain an antisense or an interference RNA which could turn the gene down or turn that gene off.
I trust the science, It's not a simple process and it takes time. So, that's the thing that people don't really want to hear.
Every step forward seems to be them discovering that HD is far more complicated than they thought. That's, if you summarize the last 4 or 5 years, that's pretty much been it.
We're on the brink of a major sea change in this for all sorts of reasons. The best stuff that's going to happen, which is really going to bring people out of the shadows, is they're going to be clinical trials. They're going to say, okay, if there's actually something out there that can make a difference, then I've got it.
Sooner rather than later, one of these clinical trials will show an intervention that significantly slows down this disease and hopefully eventually stops the disease in its tracks.
This is a pretty nasty disease that's complicated, and I think what you're going to see is that there's going to be a lot of drugs for Huntington's disease. And so you might have a drug that, is for the brain, and you might have a drug for the muscle deterioration, and you might have a drug for depression.
You'll be treated when you are still well, but not yet ill, but still carry the mutation. In other words, you'd be so-called pre-symptomatic.
I've always said that HD is the most curable, incurable brain disease.
I would say that if there was ever a time to be hopeful for the future, this is it.
I think there is a great deal of hope. There's a lot of work being done, but it's unlikely to be fast. Science takes a long time. I think people with Huntington's are coping really well, and I think we do really well here with the sort of support and the things that we can offer them.
As for me, I'm scared to be optimistic. I watched my mum wait for 20 years for a treatment, and I have no idea where this leaves my brothers and me.
So I've been off running for about 4 months. Back running now, I just started about 2 weeks ago. So yeah. Problem with the exercise just has to come first, doesn't it? It's the only thing we've got.
feel like giving up?
No. Well, we've been married 50 years in a couple of months' time. Sure, I threaten her at times. I say, if she won't open her mouth for a medicine or something, well, you're off to the rest home. But I don't mean it. I don't mean it.
I can see that Dad doesn't want to let Mum go. He wants to keep her here. He's not religious, so here is the only place there is. So he wants to keep her with him as long as he can.
Happy birthday to you. Big breath. Big breath.
What if she can't blow?
No, she mightn't be able to do, but we could try. Got to give her a chance. Come on. Big breath. Take a big breath. Big breath.
Yeah.
A bit bigger than that. Yeah, go.
Oh, good work, Mum.
Down a bit. Oh, keep going. Keep going. One more. Ready? Set. Go.
Blow it out, Mum. Big breath. Blow it out.
Good. Fantastic. Fantastic. Keep going.
I can blow those all out.
Keep going. Oh, these are the start again ones, are they? Oh, that was a good one, too. Oh!
Yay!
Three more. Three more.
One, two, two more. You do that one. You want to do this one? Ah, beautiful.
Happy birthday! Happy birthday!
I live with the knowledge that my beautiful brothers will most likely lose their minds and die slowly, trapped in unresponsive bodies, unless they choose another way out. And Jeff and my sons will most likely have to watch me do the same. But despite all this, somehow on this journey I've discovered that I'm stronger than I thought. I've looked the enemy directly in its yellow eyes and told it to beware. If it wants to take us all on, then fine. Good luck to it. I know for sure it still hasn't seen the full strength of my family.
There's a secret that I hold, never whispered, never told. It's a secret that is written on my heart, never touched by light of day. In my bloodstream it must stay. It's a gift for you and given from the heart. Well, my face is wet today, not tears but ocean spray. I am bringing you a gift from the heart.